So where does agriculture fit into our greenhouse gas emissions? Well, this pie chart shows you where our greenhouse gases are coming from as of about 2011. And you can see that about a third of them come from electricity generation. And that's because we're very heavily dependent on coal. And coal is a pretty big source of carbon dioxide. Then some comes from direct fuel combustion and transport, a little bit from what they call fugitive emissions up here, and that's things like leaky wells, leaky pipes and so on. A little bit when they sort out how much forest is being grown to how much forest is being cut down, then it works out to about 5% comes from deforestation and forestry, a few from industrial processes, and about 15% from agriculture, which is actually quite high for a developed country. Now, when I talk about that, I don't mean emissions from your tractor or the generator. I mean emissions from the livestock, the land operations, and cropping, fertiliser use, and so on and so forth. But that's actually quite high for a developed country, and it reflects the fact that agriculture still holds a very strong place in our economy. The only country in the developed world that has a higher proportion of its emissions coming from agriculture is New Zealand. New Zealand has about 50% of its emissions coming from agriculture, mainly from dairy, and about a quarter of their emissions in total are attributed to one company, Fonterra. So that company has a very strong interest in that country's policy. And that percentage, that proportion, varies over time. So a few years ago, it was about 18%, so about 10 years ago, about 18% of our emissions came from agriculture. Now it's around 15%. What do you think changed, say, between 2000 and 2012 that would cause agriculture's emissions to drop? Drought. And drought has been the biggest determinant of agricultural emissions. So up till now, they've been out of farmers' control. Not totally, clearly. But the big picture suggests that the big driving force has been the weather. And those emissions, from a policymaker's perspective, are dispersed across 100,000 plus businesses. It is relatively easy to formulate a policy, a law, to deal with emissions from an aluminium smelter or a coal-fired power station, or even the car fleet of a state government. It is much more difficult. It is an absolute headache for policymakers to try to deal with 100,000 plus farmers. And there are very few off-the-shelf, cost-effective alternatives to doing what you're doing now that would result in fewer emissions or lower emissions. And so for those reasons, as well as measurement and monitoring of farming emissions, and few obvious incentives for abatement, for all those reasons, the government has said, right, we're going to impose a price on emissions from all of these other sectors, or most of these other sectors, electricity and direct fuel, fugitives and so on, not yet transport entirely. Agriculture will not be taxed directly for its emissions. Yes, there'll be some pass-through of cost as the cost for these guys rises, but you will not be taxed for your emissions directly because it is too hard. From the point of view of the people sitting in Canberra, it is far too hard. So they're not going to do it. And in fact, no political party in this country supports taxing agriculture for its direct emissions, including the Greens. No one. So there's no political appetite for it. In the future, anything's possible, but at the moment, they've decided to not regulate and not tax you. But you can see that over time, those emissions have changed. So this tells you where they're coming from. So this little bit up the top here, this is actually, this red part, this is actually prescribed burning of savannas, which doesn't affect you, but it's a big source of emissions. Then in here are agricultural soils, and the total proportion of emissions from agricultural soils hasn't changed much. It's been pretty constant, but it's gone up and down. And down here you have enteric fermentation, cow and sheep burps, methane from cow and sheep, from livestock, from ruminant livestock. An entirely natural byproduct of raising livestock is methane, and methane is a potent greenhouse gas. And you can see that these have changed over time from 1990 and they're projected to rise over time. But you can see they've all closely mirrored each other, a little bit more burning up here, and then dropping down as the drought hits. But now starting to pick up as people restock and agricultural activity gets back on its feet. And they're projected to rise. And of course, if these other guys reduce their emissions, as they will with the carbon tax, they will start to reduce their emissions, and nothing is done about agriculture, then that proportion of agriculture's contribution will rise, and that doesn't look good. This big chunk is methane. There's some methane that comes out of savanna burning and stubble burning and so on and so forth. That's a byproduct too. And they can actually tell the difference, by the way, between methane from fossil fuels, such as leaky gas pipes and wells and things, which is a big source of methane, and methane from biological sources like sheep, cattle and fires, burning vegetation. They can tell the difference because these different molecules leave a little radioactive signature from their origin. So they can actually track methane over long periods of time, over the centuries. And methane levels in the atmosphere, the highest they've been for 800,000 years. They can look inside deep ice cores that they pull out of the Antarctic and the Arctic. And they can tell from the tiny bubbles inside what the composition of the atmosphere was like 800,000 years ago. And they can tell you that methane levels have been rising. And they've been rising since the Industrial Revolution, as we started producing more livestock and we started exploring more fossil fuels and so on, and destroying more vegetation. But I mustn't get waylaid because this stuff fascinates but probably bores you silly. Okay, but this is not about blame. This is not about saying, oh, you've done bad, aren't you bad farmers? And I know farmers often feel like people are treating them as environmental vandals. Well, this is not about that. It's just about a consequence that we now are recognising. It's a consequence of doing good, of good things. But there's a lesson in ecology, and that is there is no such thing as a free lunch. And so the price we're paying now for the good stuff we've done and the excellent work that you guys have done in producing food and fibre to feed 5 times our population, we've now got a problem that we have to deal with.